The Heart of History by John Weir Perry, Chapter 2. Lo, They Beheld. When embarking upon a discussion of visionary experience, I find myself mindful of the rather lowly place to which our culture has relegated it. The very words that once were used to convey awe and respect for it now have been degraded to the level of trivialities. For instance, a recent article on the newsstands was entitled 10 Great Myths About Physical Fitness, by which was meant 10 horrendous misconceptions due to erroneous information. According to current usage, myth signifies a falsehood belonging to a context of common sense thinking that regards myth as composed of unreal persons and events. The mention of visions nowadays suggests phenomena that rouse dark misgivings that something like hallucination is involved, and mistrust results. The term visionary has fared a little better in a way, referring now to anyone daring enough to have new ideas, especially in politics. As far as the expression, lo and behold, however, that has become a common joke referring to something like pulling a rabbit out of a hat. It is revealing, contrary to present-day biases for reality-based, rational, common-sense thinking, to contemplate the expression lo and open our minds to its flood of suggestive meanings. When the word is uttered, it induces a particular state of mind, inviting wonderment for the strange things one is about to behold, visions of the extraordinary, images of otherworldly import. At such a moment, there occurs an inflow of mythic happenings. To perceive them, one must relax one's usual consciousness geared for the acuity of thought, feeling, and perception needed for dealing with the mundane world, and instead give rein to the play of images arising out of the deep psyche. It is somewhat like the ceremonial entrance into the world of fairy tales, once upon a time, where one leaves the world of the ordinary and enters the realm of other beings. Such an indication invites a feeling that is full of expectation, one that is prepared for the magical, the mythic, or the divine. At the end of the story, an equally functional expression, and they lived happily ever after, exhorts us to snap out of it, to bring that state to a close and re-enter the mundane world, for we are speaking here of altered states of consciousness, the most intense of which are the visionary states. When the fairy tale excites this special state of wonderment in a playful spirit, the forebears of such tales were myth and ritual forms that had a far more serious import. In ancient cultures, in their early years at least, these were regarded as necessary to both the spiritual and the material well-being of a people, and the narration of these oral literatures, together with their representation in dramatic form on regularly repeated occasions, were considered absolutely vital for maintaining in their due order the forces at work in nature and in society. Origins of myth and ritual. To show how alive with urgency those practices were, this chapter is given to probing into the moments of origin of some myths and into the conditions in which they were born into the world. I have found, to my surprise, that myth-making characteristically has not occurred in the placidity of contemplative states amid stable and quiet circumstances, but rather in the turmoil of crisis and cataclysm. We do not know for certain about the origins of myth and ritual in prehistoric times, but can surmise that in the era of the Neolithic Revolution, to use Gordon Child's term, the advent of a new agriculture transformed societies and gave rise to drastic changes, comparable to the kinds of effects produced by the urban revolution some 6,000 years later in a way of life of peoples. Within historical times, at least, we can say with some assurance that new myths are the product of stress and changing conditions. Profound change is sensed as hazardous to the continuity of the familiar, and hence to life itself, whether individual or collective. Cultures as well as the individual have alarm reactions designed to preserve the life of the organism. Altered conditions threaten the integrity of the ethos and ethos of a society, its system of values and of meanings. Whether by invasion or diffusions of new elements from outside, or by the creation of new ones from within, drastic change challenges the viability of a culture. In rousing its response to such a stimulus, a certain course of events tends to occur, registering the distress and the effort toward establishing some new equilibrium. This process of acculturation and rapid culture change has received the attention of anthropologists in recent decades and presents to psychology the task of formulating the laws that govern the psyche's modes of handling crises. Their research throws into a new perspective the phenomena of the activation of psychic depths, whether in visionary states or in their psychotic equivalents. I put it this way because I have found in observing several hundred episodes of this nature that the acute psychotic process is a myth-making one in which the imagery symbolizes the leaving of old ways and the embarking on new ways as the psyche strives to reorganize. The ground plan of visionary experiences. For an example, I will cite a case of psychotic visionary experience that I have already published to indicate how closely it approximates the making of prophets. A young lady at the moment of her psychotic decompensation found herself dying and entering the afterlife, and she believed the people around her were the dead returned to life. She was immediately thrown back, in her imagery, to the world's beginning and felt herself to be Eve in the Garden of Eden, and also to be a new virgin mother of a divine child. A little later she sensed herself caught up in plots and counterplots at the world's center between two opposing world factions, engaged in a power struggle for power and supremacy. One day she looked out the window upon a storm and saw in the play of thunder and lightning the vision of a series of three holy men, Moses, Paul, and Luther. It was revealed to her that she was chosen to be the fourth in this lineage, and thus was to become the leader of a new religious era, as the reincarnation of the same great divine spirit that had entered history 3 times before. Then a further wonder appeared to her. She saw the Bay Area in a cataclysmic upheaval, opening up and dropping under to become a new hell. A new world order descended in spaceships from the sky to establish a new version of the heavenly city, a new Bethlehem at the center of the world. There was to be no one savior, but each oldest son was to be a son of man, all perfect, and as children, knowing everything of importance so as to have the wisdom to live sensibly together in peace. The parallels between the visionary experience of such psychotic individuals and those of prophets are so numerous and so close that they will become readily apparent as I narrate various instances of the formation of new cults. Themes of seeing visions in the thunderstorms, of death and resurrection, of the return of the dead, of the dropping away of the old world and creation of the new, of conflict between cultures, of the election of a prophet as a new version of an old and venerated one, and of the formation of a new society of an elect. All may be found in the initiatory visions of famous reformers, just as they were in the young lady's experience. As an example, in South Africa, at the time when certain Zionist cults were forming, one of their prophets, Shembe, was a savior among the Zulus. In his early years and through his adolescence, he had visions, always in thunderstorms, which made known to him his religious calling. He was to leave his family and follow the Lord, from whom he would receive the gift of healing. In one of these states, Shembe beheld his own body lying dead and decomposed, after he became a miracle worker. He proclaimed himself a new Moses, a leader of his people, and a king of the Nazarenes in the manner that Christ had been king of the Jews. He was called the Black Christ and established a center of worship on a sacred mountain, as a new Zion and holy city. When he died, he was buried as a saint. Another such black prophet founded the Church of the New Salem and advocated a new Jerusalem. During thunderstorms, he had visions, perceiving a lightning bird as the voice of Jehovah. He beheld his own dead body, understanding it to signify his old native culture, which was destined to die and rise again in a different form, one that would reject both paganism and white Christianity. We find further similarities between prophets and psychotics experiences in the Western Hemisphere in the later part of the last century. The ghost dance, a phenomenon that took place among the Native Americans, promising them a new hope of survival, swept through the tribes from coast to coast. Its earliest prophet was one Wadziwab, who lived in the tribes of western Nevada. In a revelation he had on a mountaintop, the Great Spirit announced to him a major cataclysm to come, which would shake the entire world. The earth would open up and swallow the white man, who would drop through and vanish forever from the Amerindian land. Their goods, however, would remain for use by the Amerindians. In further visions he saw that the earth rolled up like a carpet, and also that a rift appeared which would engulf the people in a chasm, but the followers of the new cult would come back to life in a few days. They would find themselves living and mingling in the presence of the Great Spirit and the ancestors risen from the dead. With all these events, a new heavenly era would be established. The ghost dance gave cultic expression to this new myth and a new spirit of hope to the people. It should be evident, then, in these various instances, that the experiences of persons in visionary states bear remarkably close resemblance to one another in their contents and motifs, whether these men or women be regarded by their cultures as psychotics or as prophetic. In the crisis of reorganization, the psyche draws each time upon the same repertory of images that expresses its own processes. The work of prophets. I am assuming that most readers are as unfamiliar with the myth-forming process in tribal, pre-urban cultures as I was when I set out upon these investigations. Because of recent events such as the disaster at Jonestown, where the community's fanatical devotion to a cult leader with obviously destructive motivations led to mass suicide, it is difficult for our generation to consider such phenomena with sympathetic understanding. Indeed, we are skeptical toward cults. The history of prophetism is replete with stories of unfortunate appearances of cults that one can only lament as mistaken. These occurrences, however, do not detract from the equally noteworthy fact that history has more ample instances of myth and cult that have marked the turning point of their cultures from spiritual impoverishment to enrichment and fresh vigor. Without the visionary work of prophets to reanimate their people in such conditions of demoralization, cultures have been prone to disintegrate and even disappear. I suppose, too, that most readers expect really practical reforms to come only by the work of clear reason. Myths, after all, though poetic and colorful in their suggestive meanings, are not rational, at least in the orthodox sense. When there are urgent, pressing needs for change, we are not inclined to look to the non-rational mind for leads. Therefore, while I narrate the following anecdotes of visionary experiences among leaders in unsophisticated tribal, pre-urban societies, and at the end, one or two from urban ones, I ask the reader to suspend the predilection for practical thinking things through and to give credence to the experiences of the non-rational. Examples of messianic cults. In a comprehensive review of messianic myths and cults of most parts of the world, Lanternary finds certain regularities that recur from culture to culture. These I will recount in order to provide some guidelines to help make sense of the narratives that follow. All appear to involve a belief that society will return to the conditions prevailing when it began. Its new millennium to come is based upon that of the Golden Age. Endzeit is based upon Irzeit, the end time upon the primordial time. Cataclysm and catastrophes are the prelude to the end of the world, and the rising up of the dead is a consistent feature. Reversal of the existing social order is accompanied by the ejection of a foreign oppressor who is causing disruption of the culture's familiar ways. The regeneration of the world then introduces an age of abundance and happiness, ruled by a Messiah whose redemptive action fulfills the people's hope to restore their tradition. The recreator of the world is usually the personification of the historical national hero, whose return has been long awaited. He is often the ancestral founder of the culture and the lineage of its leadership. In cases where the crisis is occasioned from the outside by the impact of an oppressor, this Messiah saves his people by a militant struggle against the foreign influence and power. Where it is from the inside by indigenous needs for reform, he saves by fostering more sophisticated ends, that is, spiritual and ethic values. Similarly, in a study of the messianic cults occurring in India, Fuchs has found such regularities of motifs and summarized them in over a dozen categories. The characteristic common features are that the society is intensely dissatisfied with its social and economic conditions. Emotional unrest and hysterical symptoms, along with the abuse of drugs and alcohol, becomes prevalent. A charismatic leader rises and makes demands for the implicit faith and obedience of his followers. A test of their faith takes the form of a change in their way of life and destruction of their property. He rejects the established authority and issues a call to rebellion, often also threatening severe punishment of opponents and traitors. The ideology has elements reminiscent of the Golden Age and reflects a renewed interest in the society's tradition, thus restoring the pristine culture and rejecting its foreign counterpart. There is, however, a desire for heaven to bestow the aliens goods and for society to adopt some of the traits of the superior culture. A mythology is developed envisioning renewal of the world through a catastrophe which is followed by the establishment of an earthly paradise and hence a new golden age. Among these crisis cults, as Western Weir has called the messianic phenomena accompanying the process of rapid acculturation, perhaps the most famous are the cargo cults of Melanesia. At the end of the last century, in the Milne Bay, a prophet named Tokeru arose who proclaimed a cataclysmic series of events ushering in a new world era. This was to start amid the myth and ritual conditions of the new year and with its feast of the departed. As usual, the world would undergo upheaval and regeneration, ushered in by volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and floods, and unbelievers would be swept away. Winds changing to the southeast would transform and fill the earth with the spontaneous abundance of crops and fruits. This new era would be marked by the arrival of ships in which the deceased ancestors would come back to visit their families. After Tokeru, other prophets followed, foretelling the advent of ships bearing material goods deriving from the white man, tools, clothing, money, and other such objects of envy. Not only liberation and the abolition of slavery, but prosperity, well-being, and equality would be the gifts from the sea in these new times. The sense of these prophetic promises seems to be that ghosts to these people are white. Therefore, the white men bringing their extraordinary products on their ships must be from the spirit world, and their cargo the gifts of the dead. In Polynesia, the corresponding cults of liberation are particularly interesting for our present discussion in that their derivation from the New Year festivals is not unlike that of the Israelite messianic expectations springing out of the New Year rites of the ancient Near East. For at the turn of the year, in this myth and ritual tradition, the dead were believed to return and were given reverence, and a ritual combat was enacted with a military drama to protect the ordered world and establish an ideal era. In the new crisis cults, these elements developed into the larger picture of world regeneration and resurrection of the dead to live again in a new cosmic era. The old ritual combat now became the hope to war against the church and government of the Western outsiders. These cults differed from those of other island societies in that their more belligerent aspect derived from the social conditions in which these people had developed military and political aristocracies, hierarchies that found their mythic expression in a supreme deity. The disturbing impact of the white colonial powers upon these island people is paralleled by a similarly devastating effect upon Native Americans in the New World. The struggle of these societies to survive has most frequently met with disastrous failure and even their absorption and disappearance into the urban life of the white dominant culture. Yet there is much to learn from the accounts of certain ones that responded to the new conditions with a strong revivification under prophetic leadership. A remarkable visionary among Native Americans was Handsome Lake of the Seneca, an Iroquois tribe, who became their reformer and prophet at the beginning of the 19th century. His people had suffered such a decay of their ways that they found themselves little more than a slum culture at the time. It seems to happen sometimes that a reformer falls into a condition as personally demoralized and ailing as that which his society is experiencing as a whole before he can embark on the visionary journey. Such was the case with Handsome Lake, who was suffering so deeply from bereavement at the death of his niece that he had sunk into bitterness and depression. Compounding these was his shame at having committed a sacrilege, when in a state of drunkenness he had blurted out some of the sacred songs. So deeply ill did he become that he was thought to be dying. A coldness crept over his body until, in the course of it, only a single point on his chest remained hot, and from this the warm vitality gradually returned to his trunk and limbs. In the midst of his death-like coma, he was experiencing several visions. At the start, 3 angels gave him directives from the Creator telling him how things must be among his people, naming the evils to be abolished. But this was only the beginning of grander things to come. Ecstatic states in shamans and prophets alike frequently provide occasion for ascent into the heavens where secret things are revealed. In such a trance, Handsome Lake was taken by the Great Spirit on a sky journey as if he was entering his death. He traveled a bright road where he found to be the Milky Way, and on it discovered he was following the tracks left by human souls in their death. As he beheld before him a brilliant light, the way divided into a wide path at the left leading to hell, the land of the Punisher, and a path to the right ascending to heaven, the land of the Creator. Then there appeared the frightening agency of world destruction, a so regularly occurring feature in prophetic experience. In the eastern sky, Handsome Lake was shown 2 drops of fire, one red, one yellow, which threatened to ascend and spread death over the world in the great sickness. His mission was to prevent this catastrophe with the help of the 3 angels and the Great Spirit, supplemented by the reassuring presence of a large white object in the western sky that functioned to regulate the air. At this point, the task of throwing off the yoke of white dominance and oppression was framed curiously in the appearance of 2 foremost revolutionaries, Christ and George Washington, who were encouraging him to set about winning independence. Some ritual instructions were given as well to preserve the ceremonial traditions of his people, but more urgently a sacrifice should be made to avert the great sickness that would otherwise bring an end to the world. Following his revelations, Handsome Lake took his high mission in too grandiose a spirit and became far too overzealous, persecuting witches and alcoholics, sometimes to their death. In a third vision, then, the 3 angels set him on the right way once more, turning his attention to codifying his revelations and revivifying certain ceremonies. There then being a need for new leadership and government for the Seneca, he appointed members of his family to office. The outcome of these visionary revelations and their impact on the cult following was no small achievement. It was the revival of the Seneca nation into a new future. Adaptation to the larger society was also improved when a Quaker arrived to give advice on the issues of acculturation. The net effect is impressive, for the Seneca have remained a self-respecting people with some cohesion and with a special talent for steelwork. There are certain parallels between these visionary forms and those of the Native American ghost dance. In the latter part of the last century, a Paiute, John Wilson, experienced revelations that led to his becoming a messianic prophet. His name Wovoka had implications of being the son of God. His first visionary experiences came upon him characteristically after an illness and high fever, and a new cult was soon ordained. One account describes cosmic events. He saw an eclipse of the sun, and, like Handsome Lake, he took a journey to the other world where he saw the Great Spirit and met Amerindians who had died and were forever young and happy. There followed then the fruits of his visions, the power to govern the elements, the rain and time itself, revelations of ethical instructions. He was enjoined together with his followers not to harm or fight and to do right at all times. In his vision of world regeneration, the dead would return to life, bearing gifts, but, as usual, the white people would be carried away by a high wind. Poverty, disease, and death were to be eliminated, and this promised land was to be only for the Amerindians. Another account says of Wovoka that he led an uneventful life as a shaman until the coming of the ghost dance and the peyote ceremony. On this psychotropic substance, he had the customary celestial visions in which he was guided to the heavenly kingdom, and its secrets were made known to him. He saw images of the life of Christ and his road from his ascent to the moon. Wovoka was instructed to remain on this road for the rest of his life. He beheld also the abode of the moon and the sun and fire, as well as the ancestral spirits. He was given directives for the layout of the sacred area for the big moon chants and ceremonials, in which the role of Christ was transferred to the peyote spirit. From his many visions he was recognized as a healer, a clairvoyant, a composer of chants, and a prophet through whom the Great Spirit would speak. The ritual dance represented several renewals, the end of the familiar world and its regeneration, the return of the dead, and the revival of the Amerindian society. Evaluating cultic movements. In discussing these prophetic and messianic movements, the question that most naturally and most urgently comes to mind is whether their occurrence necessarily means that it is in the best interest of the people to follow them. Since they arise out of a mythic dimension, must this somehow imply that they are benign and for the general weal of the society? It must be emphatically stressed that by no means have these kinds of movements always been beneficial to the spiritual or material health of the community. One might justifiably make the observation that the same hazards prevail over the outcome of prophetic cults as over the psychotic form of the renewal process. If the prophet is sufficiently paranoid, for example, he may become severely overbearing and tyrannical, punishing with death anyone who does not grant him allegiance. An example of the disaster of despotism is found in the career of Colaskin among the Native American Sampoy in the last century. In the manner so common to prophets, he suffered a severe illness, finally succumbing to it and being pronounced dead. In wondrous fashion, he then came to life during the preparations for his burial and sang a song newly created by him. He related visions that occurred during his death experience. While watching his own healing process in this state, he was instructed by the Creator to preach new reforms that would similarly heal the social body to which he belonged. A second visionary state concerned the usual world catastrophe motif, leading him to predict floods that later would destroy all of humanity except his own followers. In preparation for the event, he began work on building an ark. At this point, however, he became carried away with the sense of power and took the authority of judgment into his own hands, throwing into prison all who refused to obey him. This extreme and authoritarian rule inevitably caused rifts, which soon grew into feuds and open battles, until the government in turn came down on him in the same spirit and threw him into a federal penitentiary. Another unfortunate result of prophetic cults may occur out of naivete when people are led into toilsome and fruitless ventures with seductive promises that are not fulfilled. Prophets have offered their followers the allure of a new city, a new age in some faraway place toward which all would migrate, only to end up experiencing the most painful of hard-won disillusionments. The extraordinary concreteness with which the imagery of a new age may be taken is exemplified by a Brazilian tribe. In the 15th century AD, the Tupi-Guarani migrated in several waves even to the west coast of the continent in search of the promised land without evil. Their shamans persuaded their followers to stop work in their fields, since the harvest would come of their own accord and in abundance to each home. The shamans convinced them, too, that their enemies would surrender in the same spontaneous spirit. Consequently, they no longer spent their time in toilsome work, but rather in ritual dances. In the 16th century, the Tulinapas similarly left their villages by the thousands to seek the land of immortality and perpetual rest, trekking westward for 9 years, their spirit being kept up by the performance of miracles by the shamans and by their fear of death and destruction at the imminent end of the world. Many are the funny and sad incidences of prophets giving their people the hope of a new age in which their well-being would be supplied without labor. The faithful would thereupon lay down their hoes and plows and await the miracle, only to find that poverty and starvation were overtaking them. Another example of this was seen in the 1930s, when one of the cargo cults of the Solomon Islanders was entranced with the belief that a cataclysmic flood would eliminate the whites from among them. Members were instructed to work at building storehouses for the goods that would soon arrive by ship, inasmuch as this event could supposedly only occur when they had run out of their own provisions. They were told to desist from their work in the fields to hasten the miracle. Governmental authorities put a stop to the rebellious movement by arresting its leaders. Occasionally, a prophet would come to grief at the hands of state authorities by being pronounced insane. This happened to one Bedward in Jamaica half a century ago. He declared the vision, by now so familiar to us, of celestial journeys and of the end of the world. He was to be taken, like Elijah, to heaven, and would then return to give judgment as to who should follow him there. And at this second coming, the whole earth would be destroyed by fire. He called himself Christ, Son of God. With the inevitable failure of his ascension and glorification, he was arrested and committed to an asylum as insane. How fine is the line of distinction between prophet and patient? In evaluating the validity of visions and visionaries, it would seem, as I have mentioned, that the same principle might apply to the unfortunate collective movements as to the individuals in psychotic states. The fault in both may be said to lie in the misunderstanding of the symbolic nature of visionary images. The events promised may be valid as long as they are seen as belonging more rightly to the progress of the spiritual life of a people, not to the mundane level of outer reality. That is, they are appropriate to the imagery symbolic of psychic potentials more than to the literal depiction of outer events to come. The point brings us to the question of the functional significance of these visionary experiences. Formulations of revitalization movements. The few brief illustrations cited here should give at least some impression of the universality of the phenomenon that in any part of the world, the visionary state and the consequent crisis cult tend to accompany the process of acculturation. They constitute what a.f.c. Wallace has described as revitalization movements in rapid culture change. His model of these movements is particularly useful to the present discussion in that he relates them to the extraordinarily altered state of consciousness that the prophetic leaders reach, and he sees in these the spawning ground of new myth and ritual forms. As Wallace formulates it, a set pattern of behavior emanates from the established cognitive structures and value systems of a culture and becomes a mazeway. This is the sum of all the responses to its conditions that a society has learned through its problem-solving activity. As long as these ways are effective and constant, the culture's steady state prevails. When new conditions arise due to the impact of foreign interventions or of indigenous changes, trouble may set in. If the old solutions do not handle the new problems, unrest and frank distress are felt throughout the society. For example, in its original steady state, Handsome Lake Seneca Nation had offered certain avenues to men to fulfill their roles, experience their effectiveness, and feel the consequent self-esteem. They could become skilled hunters, warriors, or statesmen. Yet when the white invasion and containment deprived them of each of these opportunities, an acute loss of morale prevailed, and something resembling a slum culture resulted. Typically, the period of distress is marked by both cognitive and affective dissonance. The old world of meanings and values breaks down by no longer fitting the new conditions. The emotional stress of this disorientation is marked by symptoms of various kinds: psychosomatic, hysterical, or addictive. In this general unrest, certain individuals who are sensitive and unstable tend to experience profoundly altered states of consciousness. Those who have the ability to articulate and the charisma to convey their visions gather a following. For one to become a prophet, one must have a vision that offers what is needed for the times, and the new myth must be received by the people. In this cult-forming history, Wallace sees a pattern in which a hallucinatory style of experiencing visions appeals first to an inner core of immediate associates who share them in much the same mode. Secondarily, the zeal is reflected in a larger following of enthusiastic converts of more hysterical makeup, who adopt in a dissociative mode a new second personality and who may lose it as readily. The several phases of the process of rapid culture change are then formulated as follows. 1. A steady state, as a period of moving equilibrium with only slow culture changes. 2. A period of increased individual stress, in which the equilibrium breaks down by a failure to provide satisfaction of needs. Stress becomes intolerable and disillusion widespread, as the culture is perceived as disorganized and inadequate. 3. A period of cultural distortion, as members seek to restore some degree of personal equilibrium by socially dysfunctional expedients such as alcohol, drugs, breaches of mores, and violence. 4. The period of revitalization, made up of several components: the formulation of the new code that arises from the visionary revelations expressed by the prophet, a cultural mazeway resynthesis that is elevated to the status of the supernatural and which sets up a goal culture, its communication to a following attracted by its more highly organized system. This organization draws disciples of a variety of sorts: those who experience the resynthesis, those enthusiasts who are converted, and those opportunists who join as an expediency. An adoption sets in that tends to harden the code, which goes increasingly nativistic and hostile to dissenters and to national enemies. A cultural transformation is brought about that brings an abatement of the symptoms of stress and dissonance and cultural distortions. Finally, with an ensuing routinization, there is a shift in the movement from innovation to maintenance of the new cult and its code or political functions. And 5. The new steady state is marked by a value structure that serves as the basis for new minor and slowly continuing changes. The record of the movement is enshrined in myth and ritual forms that divinize in greater or lesser degree the leaders and events of the new order. Wallace prefers to regard a revitalization movement not as mechanical interactions of social cultural forces, but as a cognitive information processing and problem-solving process marked by creative discovery and invention. They may be seen as sudden changes in cultural gestalt, by deliberate and organized attempts to construct more satisfying cultures through the rapid acceptance of wide patterns of innovation. It is interesting to observe that while he emphasizes this cognitive and problem-solving work, he speaks of the visionary cult founders as paranoid and their visions as hallucinatory. In this and in the observation of changes in gestalt and wide patterns of innovation, I am reminded of Sullivan's description of the acute schizophrenic episode as a process reorganizing whole masses of life experience. In the Jungian model, this same picture of revitalization may be rephrased as an activation of the archetypal unconscious at a time when the previously prevailing structure of meanings and values begins to break down amid changing conditions that are presenting new problems. The conflict occurring at such a juncture constellates the opposites, and the old and the new, the familiar and the unfamiliar, become represented in the mythic expression of a clash and resulting cataclysm. The archetypes are activated when the customary learned ways fail and the instincts are in danger. That is, as long as custom is taking care of the fulfillments of existence, there is little need for the work of the myth-forming action of the psyche. The already established myth takes care of most exigencies. But when conflict enters in with changing conditions and new problems, this automatic unfolding of life is disturbed and produces anxiety. The conflict of opposites is handled then at an archetypal level, and the renewal process sets in to form a new worldview and to provide a new structure of meanings, value, and design of life. Jung's concept of the unconscious psyche, ever since his formulations of it in Symbols of Transformation in 1912, is that at its very deepest roots, its energies divide into the instinctive and the culture-making aspects. The former go into action and prescribe typical patterns of behavior in response to typical situations. The latter go into symbol formations, which are designed to convert and transform energies, to liberate them from the confines of pure instinct and set them in creative directions. The symbol is in this sense like an energy transforming machine, so to speak, and culture is an aggregate of such devices to put these energies to work. Lanterneri, impressed by the psychologically revealing qualities of the messianic movements, makes the poignant statement that there is probably no known religious phenomenon in which the dialectical interpretation of relationship between personality and culture becomes more convincing than it does in messianic cults. We may echo this appraisal and say that nowhere is the culture-forming aspect of the archetypal unconscious more explicitly demonstrated than in the renewal process, whether it be in individuals or in societies, in the culture clash of either. The imperative to withdraw. A striking parallel in the prophetic and psychotic manifestations of the visionary states lies in the imperative to withdraw. Lanterneri points out that among all the indigenous messianic movements at the unsophisticated level, the cult following is impelled by its very nature to make its escape from society and the world, to establish a society and a world of its own beyond history, beyond reality, and beyond the necessity of flight to bring change and improvement. This constitutes a temporary evasion from the world while awaiting the final redemption. The collective rituals in the form of possessions, trances, incantations, and visions are the means for achieving this evasion as an exaltation. The purpose, Lanterneri finds, is to perform the special function of making a positive contribution to the regeneration of the society as a whole by developing this foretaste of the sense of liberation and redemption. Once the desire for these has been satisfied, the need for evasion dwindles. The significance of the evasion and withdrawal appears to be the necessity to protect the operation of the archetypal psyche from intrusions by the ordinary world. The energies of the high arousal state, whether in the individual or the society, are concentrated in depth away from and protected from the mundane concerns of the everyday life context. If they are given full sway, they do their work of steering the renewal process towards its conclusion, and then, it is hoped, towards its later fulfillment in the world once more. Healing of a society and healing of an individual do not differ greatly in their modes, it seems. The point calls to mind the original meaning of the word therapy. The Greek therapia has the connotation of a waiting upon and service to, of attending, primarily, the gods. The term was applied to treatment through the cult of Asclepius, the god of medicine, where it was primarily a ritual procedure in service to him. His temple was a place apart from the world for invoking the healing visitation of the god in dream and the aloneness of incubation rites, the 40 days of visions. A final observation I want to make is that in visionary experience, the period of time that appears to be customary for the high arousal state to run its course is 6 weeks, the familiar 40 days. The mention of the number calls up well-known instances in history, most notably the visionary struggle of Jesus in his 40 days in the wilderness. In China, Hyung's death-like trance similarly lasted 6 weeks. Hyung's experience is a beautiful illustration of the relation of culture change to visionary states. In the mid-19th century, he led the Taiping Rebellion and came close to overthrowing the ruling dynasty and becoming China's emperor. As a young man, he attempted to enter the field of politics, but failed the imperial examinations. Mortified at the humiliating defeat, he underwent a severe depression. A dream convinced him that his death was imminent, whereupon he sank into a stupor so deep that his family believed him to be in the throes of death. During this time, however, he in actuality was embarking upon a visionary journey which lasted the familiar 6 weeks. In this celestial adventure, he was met by an old woman who washed him and removed his heart and other internal organs, replacing them with ones colored red, and then led him to an old man. This venerable figure elected him to the task of exterminating demons and recalling the Chinese people to their duty to him. Upon his recovery, Hyung was somewhat changed, his manner now heartier and his presence weightier, more imposing. 6 years went by before he succeeded in grasping the import of his visions. Some Christian tracts put into his hands allowed him to at last find all the meanings falling into place. He took both the Bible and his revelations as guidelines for his new reform movement called the Great Peace. Taiping, the Chinese term for a new ideal order in a regenerated world. He called himself younger brother of Jesus and heavenly king, and the Christian doctrine for his new regime was set forth in the Trimetrical Classic. In it his visions are mentioned. He was received up into heaven, where the affairs of heaven were clearly pointed out to him. The great God personally instructed him, gave him codes and documents, and communicated to him the true doctrine. With a large following and sizable army, he set up a government in Nanking for several years, but the rebellion failed militarily in the end, being blocked by the Western powers from advancing. Another delightful and colorful account of a 40-day visionary state is found in the Apocryphal book of Estrus. In preparation for his apocalyptic revelations of world generation, Esdras was instructed by the Lord to go out into the fields with 5 companions to commune with the God and record in books what was revealed to them. Take with thee these 5 which are ready to write swiftly, and come hither, and I shall light a candle of understanding in thine heart. With these 5 he went out, taking many box trees to isolate themselves from the people for 6 weeks. The Lord gave instructions to say, Let no man therefore come unto me now, nor seek after me these 40 days. And the next day, behold, a voice called me, saying, Esdras, open thy mouth, and behold. He reached me a full cup, which was full as it were with water, but the color of it was like fire. And I took it, and drank. And when I drank of it, my heart uttered understanding, and wisdom grew in my breast, for my spirit strengthened my memory. The highest gave understanding unto the 5 men, and they wrote the wonderful visions of the night that were told, and they sat 40 days, and they wrote in the day. Summary. From the foregoing accounts, it is clear that when a culture is deeply shaken by changing conditions and finds itself in need of a wholly revised orientation in order to integrate new, unfamiliar values and priorities, the psyche responds creatively through gifted individuals. Visionaries perceive the revelations of innovative myth and ritual forms that might render the meanings of the new state of affairs, and that might thus govern and channel the motivational energies to allow the next culture pattern to function as an integrated whole. Myth then serves the purpose both of affording a framework with which to integrate the new meanings, and also the dynamics needed to implement them. The awesomeness and majesty of the cosmic events in vision are the measure of the power of the new forms in respect to the insufficiency of the prevailing modes of thought to take care of the task at hand. In these visionary processes, the world image appears almost invariably as the fulcrum of the great turns of history.